A few days back, when I released a video of Next.Auth version 5 to show you how to perform social login using OAuth 2, many of you asked me the question, why don't I release another video where I can show you how to perform credential-based login? So here you go. In this video, we are going to learn about credential-based login and we are going to see everything that you need to set up for performing credential-based login. Before we get started, I would like to thank you all for your support. Without you, it wouldn't have been possible for me to continue on the YouTube channel and continue teaching you. Without any further delay, let us get started learning credential-based authentication using Next.Auth version 5. As we are building things incrementally, I will start from where I left in the last video where we have seen an authentication using Google and GitHub. I hope you remember where we had two buttons, Google and GitHub, and clicking on each of those, we could authenticate using Google and GitHub OAuth 2 by selecting the Gmail, giving a consent. I could authenticate into the system and from there I could log out as well. So now in this video for credential login, we are going to add a very simple form, a form with email ID and password. Now for the sake of that, what I'm going to do, everything inside this login form component, I am going to take this out to a different component called social login. Here I'm going to put a form with email ID and password. People who are landing to this video directly without seeing the last one, I would encourage you to see the last one because that's where I have explained about Next-Auth, auth.js and all the configurations as well, so that it becomes much easy for you to follow this credential based login as well. So I have now taken these two buttons into a separate component called social login component, which is having only that form that we were seeing inside the login form, including its import. I've just taken that out and imported social login into login form, and I'm using it and I'm getting the same UI back. I've done this because I'm going to create a form over here with email ID and password only. As it is a pretty simple form, let us create it as quick as possible. A form, inside that I'll have a couple of div. In the first div, let us have a label called email address, and along with it, I'm also having an input type email and a few class names around it. So you can see this email address over here coming up. Similarly, under this div, I'm going to have password and a label. So that's the password field and a label along with it. Right below this text boxes and label, I'm going to add a button along with a few class names so that it looks little decent. All right. Now to make the things aligned, let me add a layout to this form. A flex layout is much better, and some margin to these divs. Not bad. So I have a decent form which is having email address and a password with a button, submit button called credential login. The next thing I would be interested in is to set up everything for our credential authentication. And that's what we're going to do in auth.js file. So let's open up auth.js file. This is our auth.js file. Now, anyone coming from the previous video where I have showed that OAuth to login, you already know why I have done this Google provider and the GitHub provider. This should not be new to you. And I've also explained in details like what is this Next-Auth and what it returns and how we have utilized each of these things, sign in, sign out. We utilize them in the server action from the server component. In this video, we are going to again utilize them from the server action, but from a different place. This time we are going to utilize them from a client component, just for a change, because we have already learned about server component interaction last video. This video, let us understand with the client component to the server action for Next-Auth authentication. So a few things to do over here. Just like we have imported Google provider and GitHub provider before, now we are going to import another provider called credential provider. So let's import credential provider from, again, Next-Auth providers. Before it was Google and GitHub, now it is credentials. Simple. All right, so we have to do an authentication, right? So it means that somehow we have to match the email ID and password with some email ID and password, some user. But we don't have a backend yet. And in this video, we are not going to create a backend altogether. In the future video, I'm going to show the integration with the MongoDB. That's where you will be learning about the providers as well and the adapters. So in this video, we are going to mimic some users. And for that, inside src, create a new folder called data. And inside data, let us create a file called users.js. Here, let us create a few users in an array, some dummy users. And each of the user will have, say, email, maybe tapas@email.com. That's not my email, by the way. And then password, let's give password as a password. And let's take few more users. So I have 3 users right now. And let us write one method, export const get user by email equals to text email as an argument. Here it's going to do a simple array find. So for example, users.find user, each of the users email checking with the email that is passed to this function. If it is matching, that means is found, otherwise found is undefined. And then we will return the found. Excellent. So this particular file can think of a local database, which is having a bunch of users and a method where you can pass the email. And if the email matching, you are returning the user whose email you are matching. If the email is not matching, it's going to return an undefined. Now I'll go back to auth.js. I'm going to import this one as well. Import get user by email, because now with your this email address password, you're going to submit an email address and password when you click on this credential login button. I'm going to read that particular email and password and pass that email into this get user by email method and try to see first whether that user really exists in the DB or not. Our DB is user.js. If I get a user back, then that user's password that I'm getting from users.js, I'm going to match again with the password that you are submitting using this form. If that also match, then I'm sure that you are authenticating with the user that's there in my database, and your email and password both matches well. And then I allow you to do and go to the further step. Otherwise, I will throw an error to you. Now to make all this thing happen, we have to do again a few things. We have to tell Nextauth like what is the session management strategy we are opting for if we are going for credentials provider way of authentication. When we were going for OAuth 2 way of authentication using Google or GitHub provider, it was implicit. It was implicitly taken care. But when you are going for a credentials-based provider, we have to tell Next-Auth explicitly. That reason, inside your Next-Auth over here, you tell session, and here you have to tell what is the strategy. The strategy we're going to use JWT. Good. Now this is important and this is required. How to handle the access token, refresh token, their expiry and all these things, we can build incrementally on top of it. We'll see that in future. Now session is done, and our providers, we have one Google provider, we have one GitHub provider. Now we have to define credential provider. So let's do that. Same way, we'll say credential provider. Again, it is going to take an object inside it. Inside this object, we are going to define a function called authorize. So inside credential provider, you can implement an async function whose name is authorize. All right. Now, beauty of it, this authorize function gets a credential as an argument, and that will have the email ID and password that you are submitting over here. So if we are using Next.auth sign in method to sign in using this form, this particular authorize in our auth.js file would automatically receive this email address and password that you have typed in and submitted. Now this is great, right? If we have this email address and the password submitted in this particular object, I can now make use of get user by email to do any validation and do anything that I would like to. So let's do this. Let's do a try catch, because in case something doesn't match, I can actually throw some error. By the way, don't worry about the things that is refreshing like this in the right side, because I usually code in the autosave mode. If you are not aware of autosave mode, inside file of your VS Code, you have autosave on and off. So whenever I type, the code kind of get rebuilt locally and run locally. So sometime on certain cases where the syntax is not proper, you will get it. But once the syntax gets fixed, eventually you will see things happening correctly. So with this try, I'll have a catch. Now here, first thing that we can do, if credentials, in case it is null, return a null. Then we're going to check const user equals to get user by email. Here I'm going to pass credentials dot email. So my intention over here, whatever I have submitted as email, taking that email, go to that get user by email method into my local database and check whether the user is there or not, whether the user is found or not. Now I can put a check here. If user found, great, I'll proceed further. Else, I can basically throw an error from here saying that user not found, correct? Because user itself is not found. Now, if the user found, that means user is there in our database. The next thing that I'm going to do is to do a password match. So I'll be doing const is match equals to, I'll be matching with user's password equals to credentials password. So if this match is found, that means my user is authenticated correctly. So I can do if is match I can return the user itself, else I can throw a new error, and this time instead of saying user not found, I can still check your password. Means user has found, but the password is not matching, so I'm giving this error out, right? This authorize function is a very powerful function that's provided by credential provider. Whenever I am putting email address and password and submitting this one, I'm calling Next-Auth sign-in method. While calling the sign-in method itself, I'll tell that I'm using the credential-based provider, and that's the time this particular authorize will be called. And here we have done all logic that we have just now explained. I hope you understand that. So the next thing would be writing a server action for this one and execute the server action on the click of the submit button so that this authorize get called. So let's do that. I hope you remember the server action that we have written in the last video, which is inside actions app. I go to index.js file. We have written two server action. One is for do social login, another for the logout. Right now we are going to do another server action called export function, and it's gonna be async. Don't miss that. And we'll say do credential login. It will accept a form data because when you submit the form, it's gonna get a form data. And here we are going to a few stuff. Pay attention to this. So first the try catch as usual, and then rethrowing the error from here. Here we are going to do some fancy stuff. First, we'll get a response back. From where? From our dear sign-in method, the same method that we have used before. Now here, if you've noticed that here the action was either Gmail or GitHub, the string that we were getting from the form itself. In this case, the string that we'll be using is called credentials. That is gonna tell that we are going to use a credential-based login. So over here, we're going to use same sign-in. The first thing should be the type of logging that we are interested in, that is credentials, and then the bunch of parameters or the options that we have to pass. When we did it with Google and GitHub, same thing we did here. As a parameter, we have done redirect to home page if the login is successful, right? If here after logout, go to the page where you could see the login buttons again, right? So in this case also we can give a bunch of parameters. As it is a credential provided login, somehow I have to pass whatever I am submitting as an email address and password from this form, isn't it? So that's something you have to pass over here, saying form data.get email. The form data I'm getting over here. If you perform a get method and pass the name of the field, you will get the value of it in the form, right? That's a regular HTML thing, HTML JavaScript thing. Then password, you get form data.get and do a password. And here, instead of redirecting to any other pages, I'm going to say redirect false. Why I'm going to tell that? Because I don't want to get redirect to any other pages in case there is an error, in case there is a mismatch in email ID and password. I want to stay in the login form itself and want to give a error somewhere at the top saying that there's a problem, right? So for that, I don't want to get redirected. But if the sign-in is successful, after that I want to get redirected, that I'm going to handle in the login form itself. So from here, I'll return the response. So that's pretty much it. That's my function. Now I'm going to go to login form. Here, let me make this component as a client component, because I told previously we have seen like how the form can be submitted from a server component itself and calling the server action. But in case you have to submit a form from a client component and still have to call a server action for a thing like this, or maybe for sending email, how are you going to do that? That also I'm teaching over here. So here I'm going to first import do credential login. Okay. And here in the form, I have a class name, right? Along with the class name, I'm going to add something called on submit. So that means when the form gets submitted, and let me call a function called handle form submit. I have to define this handle form submit. So that's what I'm going to do here. Function handle form submit. This gets an event, and I can do whatever I want inside this. Now there are certain questions may come to your mind. How am I going to get the form data? I have to get email ID and password inside this particular function. Second thing, am I going to call this do credential login function from this handle form submit? The answer is yes. But if I go to this do credential login function, it's an async function. So it means when I'm going to call it from inside, I have to call using await. So it means this has to be an async function. Can I make it an async function? Yes, I can make it an async function. Great. So one problem solved. Now the problem about getting the data, form data. So first thing to do, event.prevent default. And then I'm going to put a try catch, because in case when I'm calling do credential login throwing the error, It is actually throwing the error. In case that situation arises, catch it over here and do something about it. So first thing is to get the form data. So form data equals to, you have the event, right? Now you have new form data, that's JavaScript thing again. And here you can pass event dot current target. Once you do that, again, this form data is built and it has everything for you to process. Let me give a catch over here so that my UI stop shouting. For now, let's put a console.error of e dot. So after getting form data, what I can do, the simple thing I can do is const response equals to await do credential login, pass the form data. Great. Now I can check over here if response dot error, if there is an error at all, I will do something with it. Okay. If there is no error, then I can actually go back to homepage from here. Homepage is the one where I can show logged in user email address. There is a logout button already, you know, from the previous video. So how do I go to that home page? Here, as we're in the client side, I can utilize the router functionality. First, I can import use router from Next navigation. And here I can take the router instance from use router. After taking the router instance, in case it is a success, I can do router.push of /home. So I'm going to go to the home directly, mean the home page. So far so good. Now we are doing all this thing just to tell you or just to teach you that we are able to call a server action from a form which is a client component. Previously we have seen it for server component. It was quite straightforward. We didn't have to do all these things, but here it is a client component, so that's why we are doing it. And there is a reason that why we are doing it as a client component, because in case this form is throwing some error, we are doing certain thing wrong with the email address and password, we can show the error at the top itself. Correct? We'll come to that, but before that, whatever we have done so far, let's make a test. Let's do a login, a successful login with email address and password and see whether the login is happening or not. So let's do a login with the user tapas@email.com and password is password. tapas@email.com, password is password. Credential login, great. I'm into homepage now. Awesome, isn't it? Now here you don't see an image or a broken image because that image we have made to appear for the Google and GitHub. We can actually change the logic of the homepage a bit. This is our homepage under app homepage.jsx. Here we were doing this logic, right? Like showing the user image and the username. I think we can change the logic a little bit. If image and name both happen to be there, in this case, do something else, do something else. So in the previous case, do something means let's show both of these things. In the other case, when it is not there, we can simply show the email address. So here we can show. Now you see, welcome tapas@email.com. And in the other case, we will log in with Gmail and GitHub. That time the logged in user image and name will be shown, right? So let's log out. Now one thing is pending after this, the error condition scenario, right? So for that, let us go to the login form once again. And here, as it is a client component, I can definitely take use state from React and let me define a state called error. So wherever there is an error, for example, over here, response.error, I can set it like set error response.error.message. Again, if it is coming to the catch, I can actually do, e.error.message, or I can also tell check your credentials, whatever, some message I'm just setting. Now over here, just above the form, you can now have a div, and inside this div, you can show this message, just make it little bit aesthetically better, maybe a bigger text and a red color text, right? So now if there is an error happening, I'm actually catching the error, setting some message and trying to show this error at the top of the login page itself. So now I'll give email address, which is probably not there in my DB. Let's say rexo@email.com. It doesn't exist in my DB. Give some password, do a credential login, check your credentials, I get it straight away. So this is great, isn't it? So what you have learned? You have learned how to set up credential-based authentication in the auth.js. While setting it up, you also learn how to use this authorize to do all these conditions. And we have created a local DB. Now imagine this get user by email can be a function that does the validation with your MongoDB, PostgreSQL, or whatever database in the backend, or maybe making an API call and doing something. Ultimately, it is checking whether the user exists in the DB. If the user exists, then his password matches or not. This is the core logic. Where are you getting the users from is not really related to Next.Auth or anything else. That is completely your implementation. And how this is tied, this authorize method is whenever you are submitting this form and the form is actually calling a server action over here, you are telling that I am using the credential-based login and this is the email and password I am passing it through, so that in the auth.js, when you come through this credential, you get my email address and password that I'm passing it through, and then you do all kind of validations. I hope you found this video really helpful, and if so, please post a like, please give some comment, please give some encouragement, and if you have not subscribed, please subscribe. Up next in the next auth, we'll be seeing the integration with MongoDB, and we will be doing data persistence through registration of a user, and the same user can authenticate using credential based, then the auth2 and whatever, right? And then we'll also see how to perform JWT based access token, refresh token, how to do refresh token rotation, everything. So stay tuned guys, take a great care of yourself and keep learning. Thank you.